Every single day you're being influenced, often without even realizing it. A single sentence can shift your opinion. A subtle ad can change your choice. And sometimes, even your own emotions can lie to you. But what if it's all an illusion? What if your thoughts, decisions, and even your identity are being quietly shaped by forces around you? In this video, we'll explore 30 powerful psychological tricks that shape your reality. From relationships to marketing, politics to everyday life, these techniques are everywhere. If you find this kind of content valuable, feel free to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It's a completely free way to support what I do. Now let's begin, because after this, you'll never look at the world the same way again. Did I really say that, or am I just remembering it wrong? If that thought has ever crossed your mind after a conversation, especially with someone close to you, you might have experienced the first flicker of gaslighting. It doesn't start with something big or dramatic. It often begins with something you could easily overlook. A contradiction, a denial, or a calm insistence that you're mistaken. At first, it feels like a small misunderstanding. But slowly, and almost invisibly, it grows. Gaslighting is a psychological manipulation tactic where someone tries to make you doubt your own memory, perception, or sanity. The term comes from the 1944 film Gaslight, where a husband manipulates his wife into thinking she's going insane by dimming the gaslights in their home and denying it ever happened. In real life, the process is usually more subtle and more dangerous. The manipulator may say things like, "You're remembering it wrong," or "I never said that," or even, "You're just being too sensitive." Over time, these comments make the victim question their grasp on reality, turning even their clearest memories into uncertain ground. Gaslighting can happen in romantic relationships, workplaces, families, friendships, and even in public discourse. In personal relationships, it might look like a partner denying past arguments, shifting blame, or rewriting history. At work, a boss might ignore your contributions and later claim you were never involved. In politics or media, gaslighting can take the form of rewriting events, minimizing serious issues, or questioning the credibility of facts to reshape public perception. One of the most damaging aspects of gaslighting is that it isolates the victim from their own instincts. When you constantly doubt your thoughts and feelings, you become more dependent on the person manipulating you. This power imbalance is exactly what gaslighting thrives on. You begin to question whether you're too emotional, too forgetful, or just bad at communicating. The abuser often reinforces these doubts by alternating manipulation with occasional warmth or kindness, which further confuses the victim and creates emotional dependency. Let's say you confront someone for being late to an important meeting. You're calm but firm. Instead of owning up to it, they smile and say, "You're really overreacting. It wasn't even that big of a deal." You feel a flicker of doubt. Maybe you are being too harsh. Maybe your memory of the time is off. Over time, repeated moments like this wear down your confidence. You become quieter, more unsure, and easier to control, not through force, but through manufactured confusion. Gaslighting doesn't always look like outright lies. Sometimes, it's the constant erosion of trust in your own judgment. It's the slow replacement of your narrative with theirs. And because it doesn't scream, people often don't notice it's happening until it's too late. Recognizing gaslighting is the first step in breaking free from it. It means learning to trust your own perceptions again, validating your memories, and drawing boundaries with those who repeatedly make you question yourself. It's not always easy, especially when the gaslighter is someone you care about or depend on. But awareness is power. If you often leave conversations feeling unsure of yourself, second-guessing your memory, or wondering if you're overreacting, it might be worth asking, am I being gaslit? Not all manipulation looks aggressive or obvious. Sometimes it comes wrapped in concern or calm words, but the result is the same. You start to lose confidence in your own mind. Scarcity, it always starts with a little red label. Only 2 left. Limited time offer. Last chance. You're not sure if you even need the item, but suddenly, there's a quiet urgency. Your heart rate goes up just a bit. You scroll faster. You hesitate, but only for a second, and then click Buy Now. After all, what if it's gone tomorrow? This is the scarcity principle in action, a psychological trigger that makes people place more value on things that appear rare, exclusive, or soon to disappear. It's not a trick that relies on logic. In fact, it works best when you're not thinking too hard. Scarcity taps into something older and more instinctual, our brain's natural reaction to potential loss. It makes us feel that if something is limited, it must be important. If something is running out, it must be good. And if we don't act now, we'll miss out. Marketers, platforms, and sellers of all kinds know this. Scarcity is built into the digital world, especially in e-commerce. Websites display fake inventory numbers or countdown timers. Airline ticket prices are shown increasing as you watch. Flash sales last just a few hours, and early bird offers close forever by midnight until they reappear next week. The goal isn't to inform, it's to pressure. Scarcity turns shopping into survival. But it's not just about products. Scarcity shows up in dating apps too. Limited matches per day. In job listings, accepting applications for the next 24 hours only. Even in social settings, invite-only events, VIP access, or follower-only content. The idea is always the same. If this is hard to get, it must be worth getting. And if you miss it, you're out of luck. There's also a deeper layer. Scarcity doesn't just make us want things, it makes us want them more because other people want them too. Think of limited edition sneakers, sold-out concerts, or pre-orders that crash websites. The logic isn't always clear, but the feeling is, if everyone's rushing for this, I should be too. It triggers a kind of social panic, a modern-day stampede that happens in shopping carts instead of sidewalks. To illustrate how this works in daily life, let's take a quick story. Imagine you're browsing a small online bookstore. You see a book you've never heard of. It's not on your wish list. It's not a genre you usually read. But next to the price, there's a red message. Only one left in stock. You pause. The cover looks interesting. You check a few reviews. They're decent. Not amazing, but fine. You close the tab. But an hour later, you find yourself thinking about it. What if it's gone? You open the page again. Still there. You buy it. Weeks later, you realize you haven't even opened it. You didn't buy the book because you loved it. You bought it because you thought you might lose the chance to buy it. That's the core of scarcity. It's not about the item, it's about the urgency, the fear of regret, the illusion that the opportunity is shrinking, and that the moment to act is slipping through your fingers. It overrides your normal decision-making. It makes you feel like you're chasing value, when really, you're chasing the clock. Once you start seeing scarcity for what it is, a calculated pressure tactic, you can begin to resist it. You can stop, breathe, and ask, would I still want this if it were always available? That one question can turn panic into patience. Because the truth is, most of the time, there's more than 3 left in stock. And even if there isn't, you probably didn't need it anyway. Fear of missing out. You open your phone just to check the time, but before you know it, you're scrolling through stories, reels, photos, and updates. Someone is on vacation. Someone else just bought a new car. Another person launched a business. You don't even know half of them well, but you feel it anyway. That tiny knot in your stomach, that creeping anxiety. You weren't invited. You're not achieving enough. You're behind. This is how FOMO begins. Not as panic, but as quiet comparison. Fear of missing out, or FOMO, is the feeling that others are experiencing more, achieving more, or living better. Lives than you, while you're left out. It's a social anxiety triggered by the awareness, or illusion, that something better is happening elsewhere. And the more connected we are digitally, the more vulnerable we become to this feeling. Every update you see isn't just information. It's a carefully filtered highlight. And because we rarely post our failures or dull moments, everyone else's life starts to look impossibly full, while ours feels strangely empty. Psychologically, FOMO is rooted in two powerful forces: social belonging and loss aversion. As social beings, we fear exclusion. Historically, being left out of a group could mean literal danger. Our brains haven't evolved much since then. When we see others participating in something exciting, whether it's a party, a trend, an investment opportunity, or even just a group conversation, we instinctively feel the need to be part of it, to stay included, to not be the one who's left behind. Marketers and app developers know this well. Platforms are designed to feed the fear of missing out. Stories that disappear in 24 hours, limited time offers, event notifications, trending hashtags. Every alert is a nudge, a whisper, that says, everyone else is here, why aren't you? Even products are sold with language designed to stir urgency, only available this weekend, or join before it's too late. But FOMO isn't just about social media or sales. It appears in deeper decisions too. Choosing a college or a job. Deciding whether to move cities or stay put. People often don't ask themselves, do I want this? Instead, they ask, what if I regret not doing it? This backward fear, regret before action, can push us into commitments we don't truly want, just to avoid the discomfort of wondering what we might have missed. Let's ground this in a moment you might recognize. You're at home on a Friday night. You had plans to relax, maybe read or watch something low-key. You feel fine, but then you check your phone. A group of friends is out at a rooftop bar. The lighting is perfect. Everyone's laughing. Glasses are raised. You suddenly feel like you made the wrong choice staying in. You're not unhappy, but now you're unsettled. Should I have gone? You wonder. Am I boring? You weren't missing out until someone showed you what you were missing. That's the paradox of FOMO. It doesn't exist until it's triggered. You weren't anxious until comparison entered. And once it does, it rewrites the way you feel about your own life. Your quiet evening becomes dull. Your confidence turns into second guessing. FOMO hijacks contentment and replaces it with longing. Longing, not for something specific, but for the feeling of not being left out. So how do you deal with it? Awareness is the first line of defense. If you can name the feeling, you can start to question it. Ask yourself, do I really want what I'm seeing, or do I just not want to be left behind? Often, you'll realize it's the second. And that's okay. The goal isn't to eliminate FOMO entirely, it's to stop it from making your decisions for you. Some people counter FOMO with something called JOMO, the joy of missing out. It's the idea of finding peace in being exactly where you are, doing what you chose to do, without the need for comparison. It's not about ignoring the world, it's about no longer letting it define what fulfillment should look like. Because in the end, most of what you're missing out on isn't as important as you think. And what matters most probably isn't on a screen at all. Anchoring effect. You walk into a store looking for a jacket. On the rack, there's one that catches your eye. The tag says $349. It's more than you plan to spend. But just next to it, there's another one, similar style, nice fit, on sale for $189. Suddenly, it feels like a great deal. You weren't planning to spend that much in the first place, but compared to the first price, it feels almost affordable. That first number changed how you saw everything else. This is the anchoring effect, a psychological bias that occurs when we rely too heavily on the first piece of information we receive, especially when making decisions. That initial number, idea, or impression acts as an anchor, pulling all other judgments toward it. It doesn't matter if the number is random or irrelevant. Once it's in your mind, it shapes everything that follows. And the most fascinating part is that you usually don't notice it's happening. Marketers have long mastered this principle. In e-commerce, it's common to see products listed with an original price slashed through. $299 becomes $149. That original number isn't just decorative, it's doing heavy psychological lifting. It anchors your brain to a higher value, so the sale price feels like a smart, calculated decision. In truth, the product may have never been sold at that high price, but the presence of the anchor makes the lower price look irresistible. This tactic extends far beyond online stores. In restaurants, you'll often find one outrageously priced item on the menu. It's not there to be sold. It's there to make the rest of the menu seem more reasonably priced. In subscription plans, companies list 3 options: basic, standard, and premium. The premium plan is usually anchored with a high price and filled with features you don't need. But its presence makes the middle plan feel just right. It's called the Goldilocks effect, and anchoring plays a central role in how it's perceived. Anchoring also influences non-monetary decisions. In salary negotiations, for example, whoever throws out the first number gains an advantage. If a hiring manager says, "We're thinking around $45,000, that figure becomes a mental reference point. Even if you were hoping for more, you may negotiate higher, but your counteroffer will likely still hover around their original anchor. Research shows that even numbers with no connection to the topic, like a random spin of a wheel, can affect people's guesses and decisions. That's how irrational and how automatic this bias can be. Let's consider a more relatable scenario. You're browsing for a new phone online. You see a flagship model for $1,199s. It's sleek, powerful, and completely out of your budget. You keep scrolling and find a mid-range model for $749. Still expensive, but somehow it feels more reasonable. Then you find a basic model for $390. Now that seems like a bargain. But if you had seen the $399 option first, before any anchors, you might have felt differently. Without the context of the higher prices, that lower one might have still seemed steep. The order in which you saw the numbers changed your perception of value. Anchoring doesn't just affect purchases. It affects how we value time, people, even ourselves. Think about productivity. If your to-do list starts with a task that looks like it will take 2 hours, everything else feels quick by comparison. But if the first item seems easy, the rest of the list feels heavier. The first impression frames everything that follows. Recognizing the anchoring effect is like spotting an invisible hand guiding your decisions. It doesn't mean you'll stop being influenced by it entirely, but it gives you the power to pause. When faced with a big choice, ask yourself, what's the first number or idea I encountered? Is it really relevant, or just the first thing I saw? By identifying the anchor, you give yourself room to step back and assess the situation more rationally. Anchoring isn't about deception, it's about context. But when that context is carefully controlled by others, your judgment can be nudged in ways that feel natural, even inevitable. The real trick isn't avoiding anchors altogether. It's knowing when you've been tied to one without realizing it. Social proof. You're walking through a new city, hungry and unfamiliar with the area. You pass 2 restaurants. One is almost empty, a few lonely tables by the window. The other is crowded, a short line outside, laughter spilling onto the street. You don't know the menu of either, but instinctively you gravitate toward the busy one. After all, if that many people are there, it must be good, right? That reaction is a textbook example of social proof, a psychological principle where people look to the behavior of others to determine what is correct, desirable, or safe. When we're uncertain about what to do, we look to the group for guidance. If everyone is doing it, we assume it's probably the right thing. Social proof doesn't just influence us. It often replaces our own judgment, especially in unfamiliar or high-pressure situations. This principle is incredibly powerful because it's deeply tied to how humans evolved. In early human history, following the group was often a matter of survival. If others ran from a predator, you ran. If others avoided a certain plant, you didn't eat it. Mimicking the actions of the group became a shortcut to safety. Today, the threats are different, but the instinct remains. In modern life, social proof appears everywhere, often without us noticing. Online reviews, star ratings, follower counts, bestseller labels, view counts, and comment sections all function as cues to help us decide what has value. YouTube highlights trending videos. Amazon shows you what people also bought. Instagram promotes posts with high engagement. Each of these tools is subtly whispering, others liked this, you will too. Businesses deliberately build social proof into their marketing. You'll see slogans like "millions sold," "top rated by professionals," or "as seen on TV." Testimonials from influencers or celebrities serve the same function. Even something as simple as a packed store or long line outside a club signals success. We take other people's attention as evidence of worth. But social proof isn't always accurate. It's reactive, not reflective. Just because something is popular doesn't mean it's good. In fact, many viral trends spread not because of their quality, but because of visibility and repetition. If enough people believe something has value, it often becomes valuable, even if it started as a mistake or a gimmick. There's also a darker side. Social proof can lead to mob mentality, groupthink, and the silencing of dissent. In online spaces, this shows up as echo chambers, when people surround themselves with others who think the same way, reinforcing their beliefs while dismissing or attacking outsiders. In politics, it can cause polarization. In business, it can fuel hype bubbles. The more we defer to the group, the less we stop to ask, is this actually true? Is this right for me? Let's bring this down to a simple, everyday example. You're scrolling through a list of books online. One of them has 16,000 reviews and a 4.8-star rating. Another has 200 reviews and a 4.9-star rating. You barely even notice the second one. Your eyes are drawn to the more popular choice. It feels tested, safe, endorsed. You buy it without reading too deeply into the content. A few chapters in, you realize it's not your style. It's not that the book tricked you. It's that popularity became the deciding factor more than personal fit. That's the essence of social proof. It gives us permission to act when we're unsure. It's not inherently bad. In fact, it often saves us time and helps us avoid bad experiences. But when it becomes the primary reason we choose something, it can lead us away from our own preferences and values. To resist blind influence, it helps to pause and ask, am I choosing this because I want it, or because others want it? It's a small question, but a powerful one. Sometimes the crowd is right, but sometimes the quieter path, the less followed one, is where what you truly want is waiting. Because not every full restaurant serves great food, and not every empty one is a mistake. Reciprocity, you walk into a store just to browse. A friendly staff member greets you, hands you a free sample of something you didn't ask for, chocolate, perfume, maybe a skincare cream. You smile, thank them, and keep walking. But now, something feels a little different. You weren't planning to buy anything, but you start feeling like you probably should. After all, they were kind. They gave you something. It's only polite to give something back, right? This is the principle of reciprocity. One of the most powerful and universal psychological influences. It refers to our deeply ingrained urge to return a favor, whether we asked for it or not. Across cultures, societies, and age groups, people feel obligated to repay kindness. It's seen as a moral duty, a social rule. And because of this, it can be used as a quiet but effective tool for persuasion. The concept is simple. When someone gives us something, time, help, a gift, or even just attention, we feel a subconscious pressure to balance the scale. We don't want to feel like we owe anyone. Reciprocity creates a sense of social debt. And in the hands of marketers, politicians, and even manipulators, that sense of debt can be used to guide behavior without force. Salespeople often use it intentionally, offering a small freebie, something as tiny as a mint with the bill at a restaurant, can significantly increase the likelihood of a tip. In one study, diners who received a single mint tipped around 3% more. 2 mints, over 14% more. The mint had no real value, but it created the feeling of receiving something extra, something generous. That moment triggers the instinct to give something back. It's not limited to transactions. In daily life, reciprocity shows up in relationships, workplaces, and even online. A friend helps you move furniture, and now you feel like you should help them paint their apartment. A colleague covers for you at work, and suddenly you're staying late the next time they need help. You didn't make a deal, and no one asked for repayment. But the weight of obligation appears anyway. This dynamic can be healthy, even beautiful, when it's mutual and honest. But reciprocity can also be used manipulatively, when the favor is designed not out of kindness, but as leverage. For example, political campaigns might send you a free sticker in the mail, along with a donation request. Charity workers might give you a flower on the street before asking for money. The initial gift feels generous, but it's calculated. It's not about helping you. It's about increasing the odds that you'll say yes. Let's bring this into a realistic moment. You're walking downtown and someone approaches you with a smile and a sample. You accept it politely. As you thank them, they immediately begin a pitch about a product you weren't interested in. You feel slightly cornered. Saying no now feels rude. You're more likely to hear them out, maybe even agree to something small, just to exit the interaction without guilt. That first gift changed the rules of the exchange. It made you feel like you owed a stranger your time. What's important to remember is that the pressure you feel isn't coming from the other person. It's coming from inside you. That discomfort, that quiet push to repay, is internal. And it's incredibly predictable. The key to resisting manipulative reciprocity is awareness. Not all favors come with strings, but some do. The moment you receive something, especially when you didn't ask for it, it's worth asking, do I genuinely want to give something back? Or do I just feel like I should? If it's the second, take a breath. Kindness that demands repayment isn't really kindness at all. Reciprocity is one of the reasons generosity works, but when giving becomes a tactic instead of a gesture, it turns something pure into something strategic. Real giving doesn't expect. Real favors don't invoice you later, and you don't owe anyone anything just because they handed you a mint. Foot in the door technique. One afternoon, you're walking through a quiet neighborhood when someone knocks on your door. They're polite, smiling, and holding a clipboard. We're conducting a short survey on community recycling habits, they say. Would you mind answering just 2 quick questions? It sounds harmless, even helpful. You agree. It takes less than a minute. You feel good for participating. A week later, the same organization comes back. This time, they're asking if you'd be willing to place a sign in your yard promoting a local environmental campaign. You hesitate, but you already said yes once, so, almost without thinking, you agree again. What just happened is a textbook example of the foot in the door technique, a classic and widely used method of persuasion that starts with a small request and builds toward a larger one. The idea is simple. Once someone has agreed to a small, low-effort action, they are far more likely to agree to a bigger request later. That first yes opens the psychological door, making it harder to close the next time. This principle was first demonstrated in a famous experiment in the 1960s. Researchers went to a group of homeowners and asked them to place a large, ugly, "Drive carefully" sign in their front yards. Most refused. But when they first asked a different group to sign a small petition supporting safe driving, a much smaller ask, then came back 2 weeks later with the same sign request, a significantly higher number agreed. The difference wasn't the request itself. It was the path that led there. The technique works because of a few interconnected psychological forces. First is our desire for consistency. People like to see themselves as stable and coherent. If you agree to a small action, say, answering a survey, you start to view yourself as helpful or involved. Later, when a larger request is made, saying no feels like contradicting your own identity. The second force is momentum. Once we start something, we're more likely to keep going. A single step sets a direction, and that direction shapes what follows. You see this tactic used everywhere, especially in marketing and social influence. Think of websites that ask for your email in exchange for a free download. Later, they send a discount, then a limited time offer. By the time they ask for a purchase, you've already taken several small steps toward engagement. You're more likely to comply, not because of the product, but because you're already in the process. Social movements use this too. First, they ask you to sign a petition. Then, They ask you to attend an event, then to donate. Politicians ask for a simple follow or a share, then maybe a small contribution. The foot in the door is rarely loud or aggressive. It's calm, it's reasonable, and that's why it works so well. Let's go back to a real-world example. You're at home, browsing a video platform. A creator pops up asking, "If you enjoy this, please like the video." It's a small passive action. You click like. A few videos later, they ask you to subscribe. You've already liked a few. Subscribing feels natural. Soon after, you're watching longer videos, leaving comments, maybe even supporting them on another platform. You didn't plan to do any of it, but the first yes set it all in motion. The foot in the door technique isn't inherently manipulative. It can be used ethically to build habits, grow communities, or encourage involvement in positive causes. But it's important to be aware of when it's happening to you. Ask yourself, did I really want to say yes to this? Or do I just feel like I've already started saying yes to everything else? That awareness can help you pause and evaluate each decision on its own terms. Not every small favor leads to a trap, but not every trap starts big either. Sometimes it begins with two harmless questions on your front porch. Framing effect. Two doctors give you the same news, but in very different ways. The first says, "This procedure has a 90% success rate." The second says, "There's a 10% chance this procedure fails." Technically, they're telling you the exact same thing. But emotionally, those two statements don't feel the same. One sounds hopeful, the other sounds risky. You're more likely to go with the first doctor, not because of better data, but because of how it was framed. This is the framing effect, a psychological bias where people react differently to the same information depending on how it's presented. We like to believe we're rational beings, making decisions based purely on facts. But in reality, we're highly influenced by context, wording, and emphasis. The way information is structured, positively or negatively, gain or loss, risk or reward, can completely shift what we choose, even when the core details remain unchanged. Marketers, politicians, and media platforms understand this deeply, and they use it constantly. Think about food labels. 90% fat-free feels healthier than 10% fat, even though they mean the same thing. A product advertised as 20% more free sells better than one that's reduced by 20%, even if the result is identical. Headlines like "Unemployment at 5% create a different emotional response than 95% of people have jobs. The facts don't change, but how you feel about them does. This happens because our brains are wired to avoid loss more strongly than we pursue gain. It's called loss aversion. So when something is framed as avoiding a negative outcome, we respond more emotionally. For example, a health plan described as preventing disease is more attractive than one that increases health, even if both are accurate. Framing shapes perception, and perception shapes decision-making. Framing also affects choices under pressure. In a famous study, participants were asked to imagine a disease outbreak that could kill 600 people. Two solutions were presented. In one version, people were told, Program A will save 200 lives. In another, they were told, Program B has a 1/3 chance that all 600 will be saved, and a 2/3 chance that none will be saved. Even though the math worked out similarly, the way the options were framed, certainty versus probability, radically changed which program participants preferred. When the same options were framed in terms of death instead of lives saved, the preferences flipped again. Just the wording was enough to shift people's sense of risk. This principle plays out constantly in everyday decisions. Imagine you're at a grocery store buying ground beef. One label says 80% lean, another says 20% fat. Most people instinctively choose the one labeled 80% lean, not because of health content, but because the framing feels more positive. Or consider buying insurance. If a policy is described as protecting your future versus avoiding disaster, one might sound smart, the other fear-driven, but both describe the same product. Now let's drop into a subtle, real-life story. You're at a car dealership, Considering two similar vehicles, the salesperson shows you a sleek hybrid model and says, "This car saves you up to $300 a year on gas." It sounds great, you like the idea of saving, but then you check another model with a bigger engine. A different salesperson tells you, "This one only costs about $25 more per month to run." The wording is casual, friendly, even minimal. You do the math. That's actually $300 a year more, not less. But the second offer doesn't feel like a loss, just a small monthly bump. You pause. Suddenly the savings don't feel as urgent. The framing changed your sense of value. Framing doesn't just affect spending, it can influence how we judge people. Saying someone is 75% agreeable feels more positive than saying they're 25% confrontational. Describing someone as not very talkative versus socially withdrawn paints two very different images. We interpret tone, not just fact, and those tones subtly direct our opinions. The most important thing to understand about framing is that it's not necessarily deceptive. It's everywhere. It's used in contracts, in menus, in political speeches, in feedback at work, in relationships. You'll see it in arguments, advertisements, surveys, and conversations. And because it's so common, we rarely pause to question it, to resist its pull. Try to spot when two options are essentially the same, just worded differently. Ask yourself, if this were framed another way, would I still feel the same? It's a simple tool, but one that can restore clarity in the face of subtle influence. Because sometimes the difference between a good choice and a bad one is just how someone chose to describe it. Priming. You're walking through a hotel lobby. The air smells faintly of fresh linen. In the background, soft classical music plays. You're not paying attention to either, but when you reach the elevator, you instinctively stand a little straighter. You speak more politely to the person next to you. You don't even realize it, but something about the space made you act just a bit differently. This is priming in action, when subtle cues in our environment influence our behavior, thoughts, or decisions without us being aware of it. It's not hypnosis, it's not control, it's suggestion. Soft, indirect, but deeply effective. Priming works by activating associations in our brain, nudging us in certain directions. You might think you're acting freely, but your choices are already leaning in a certain way because something, somewhere, quietly set the stage. The idea is rooted in how the brain processes information. When you're exposed to a word, image, smell, sound, or even a color, it activates related networks in your mind. That activation makes connected concepts more accessible and more likely to shape your thoughts and behavior in the moments that follow. The influence is subtle but powerful. In one classic study, participants were asked to unscramble sentences. For one group, the words included polite, patient, and respect. For the other group, the words included rude, aggressive, and interrupt. After finishing, they were told to wait outside the experiment room. The participants primed with rude words interrupted the researcher much sooner than the ones primed with polite ones. No one told them how to behave, but the words they saw a few minutes earlier shifted their decisions. Priming happens constantly, in marketing and design. A luxury brand uses black and gold in its ads, not because those colors are magical, but because they're culturally associated with elegance and exclusivity. Health food brands use green, earth tones, and rustic fonts to signal natural or wholesome. None of this is stated outright, but it shapes your perception. You feel like you're making a reasoned choice, but your emotional brain has already tilted the scale. Even music primes us. In grocery stores, slow music leads shoppers to spend more time and often more money. Fast music increases urgency and speeds up shopping behavior. In restaurants, classical music leads people to order more expensive dishes, even if nothing else changes. You're not reacting to the food, you're reacting to the atmosphere. Let's walk through a subtle but familiar example. You're filling out a job application online. At the top of the page, there's a banner that says, "We value excellence, innovation, and leadership." You read it quickly, maybe even ignore it. But by the time you're writing your personal statement, You find yourself using words like motivated, driven, and creative, not necessarily because those are the most accurate, but because your brain has been nudged to speak that language. The priming worked. The company didn't ask you to say those things. They simply planted the right ideas. Priming isn't always visual or verbal. Even physical sensations can influence you. Holding a warm cup of coffee can make you judge a stranger as being more friendly and trustworthy than if you were holding something cold. Sitting in a hard chair can make you negotiate more aggressively. These effects are small, but consistent. They're happening beneath awareness. Of course, priming isn't mind control. It doesn't override your free will, but it does tilt the floor slightly, and that tilt adds up over time. When you're constantly exposed to certain cues, whether it's in your social feed, the news you consume, or the environments you frequent, they begin to shape the kinds of thoughts you have, even the kinds of decisions you make. So how do you protect yourself from being unconsciously primed? Awareness is the first step. If you know your environment is filled with cues, be it music, color, language, or imagery, you can start questioning the automatic responses they provoke. Before you make a decision, ask, what am I responding to right now? Is it the facts, or is it the feeling something created for me? Because sometimes the most persuasive voice in the room is the one you didn't even hear. Mere exposure effect. You're listening to the radio and a new song comes on. At first, it doesn't do much for you. It's fine, nothing special. A week later, you hear it again, then again, and again. You start humming the chorus in the shower. You catch yourself tapping along in traffic. Before long, you don't just like the song, you love it. What changed? Not the song. You just got used to it. This is the mere exposure effect, a psychological phenomenon where people tend to develop a preference for things simply because they are familiar with them. It doesn't matter whether the thing is objectively better or more interesting. The more often you see, hear, or encounter something, the more you tend to like it. The effect isn't about logic, it's about comfort. Repetition builds trust, and trust builds preference. The term was first coined by psychologist Robert Zajonc in the 1960s. In his experiments, he showed participants various stimuli, words, shapes, faces, and found that people consistently rated items they had seen, more often as more pleasant, even if they didn't consciously remember seeing them. In short, the more familiar something was, the more positive it felt. Marketers and advertisers love the mere exposure effect. It's why you'll see the same commercial multiple times in a single day. It's why brand logos appear everywhere, from bus stops to sports jerseys. Repetition creates recognition, and recognition builds a sense of comfort. That comfort translates into trust, and trust turns into buying decisions. You don't have to be convinced something is the best. If you've seen it more, your brain already leans toward it. This effect also explains why we often stick to the same brands, even when alternatives exist. You might continue buying the same cereal, shampoo, or toothpaste simply because you've seen it more often on the shelf, or because you saw it in your home growing up. Familiarity breeds loyalty, even when no deep emotional connection exists. But it's not just products. The mere exposure effect influences art, music, relationships, even beliefs. Consider political campaigns. Candidates repeat slogans, images, and key phrases again and again, not just to inform, but to embed. By the time voters head to the polls, the most familiar names are often the ones that feel safest, even if they don't know much about the main policies. Social media uses this principle too. Content that appears frequently in your feed becomes easier to digest, more acceptable, and, eventually, more appealing. Even ideas that once seemed extreme can start to feel normal if repeated often enough. This is where the mere exposure effect turns from a simple bias into a powerful tool for shaping norms and attitudes. Let's walk through a subtle but very real scenario. You're browsing a movie streaming platform. You notice a title with a cover that seems familiar. You've seen it featured before, maybe trending last week. You weren't interested then, but today, it feels like a safer bet than the unfamiliar ones. You hit play. A few minutes in, you realize it's not amazing, but you still watch it all the way through. It's not that it suddenly got better. It's that familiarity made it feel like the right choice. This same effect can play out in our social lives. Someone you see around regularly, a coworker, classmate, or gym goer, starts to feel more approachable over time. You don't know them well, but their presence has become familiar. That familiarity breeds warmth. It's one reason people form bonds not just through shared experiences, but through shared space. Now it's important to understand that mere exposure isn't inherently manipulative. It can help us make quicker, more confident decisions in a world full of noise. But it does mean that our preferences aren't always as personal or deliberate as we think. We like what we've seen before. We trust what's been repeated. We gravitate toward what feels familiar. To stay aware of this effect, ask yourself, do I actually like this? Or have I just seen it enough times to stop questioning it? That small moment of reflection can help you separate genuine preference from conditioned comfort, because sometimes what feels right is just what you've seen the most. Narrative persuasion. You're watching a short documentary. It's about a woman who lost her home in a fire, struggled to rebuild, and eventually found peace by starting a small bakery. You feel moved, even inspired. Later, someone tells you that this story was part of a campaign to raise awareness about housing policies. Suddenly, you realize something. You're more open to the issue, not because of data, but because of her story. This is narrative persuasion at work, the process by which stories shape our beliefs, attitudes, and even behavior more powerfully than statistics or logic alone. It's not about being tricked or manipulated. It's about how our brains naturally respond to storytelling. When we hear a story, especially one with emotional depth and relatable characters, our minds don't just absorb it, they enter it. We imagine ourselves in the situation. We feel what the character feels, and that immersion changes us. Cognitive science has shown that stories activate multiple regions of the brain, not just the language centers, but the sensory and emotional areas too. When you hear about someone running, your motor cortex lights up. When you hear about a difficult decision, your emotional processing regions engage. In essence, stories trick your brain into experiencing something as if it's real. And because of that, the lessons we draw from stories often stick much longer than raw facts ever could. This is why narrative persuasion is used in everything from advertising to political speeches, courtroom arguments, to TED Talks. A single, compelling story can humanize a complex issue, simplify difficult topics, and break through emotional resistance. Think of how charities often begin with a child's story before asking for donations, or how public health campaigns share survivor testimonials to promote change. Data informs, but narrative moves. It also explains why we may believe things, even when we know better. A gripping personal anecdote can outweigh broader statistics in our minds. You might know that flying is safer than driving, but after hearing one vivid plane crash story, you start to feel anxious about your next flight. The story left a deeper mark than the numbers. Let's take a closer look at how this plays out. In everyday life, you're scrolling on social media and come across a post. It starts with a photo of a man standing next to his bike. The caption tells a story. He lost his job, couldn't afford transportation, and started biking 12 miles a day to work. A stranger noticed, gifted him a better bike, and now he's building a life again. You finish the post, heart warmed. Without realizing it, you've just accepted a broader idea that people can overcome hardship with a little help. You might even be more inclined to donate, volunteer, or share the post. Not because you saw statistics about poverty, but because one story brought it close to you. Narrative persuasion works so well because it lowers our defenses. When someone makes a direct argument, our brains tend to push back. We weigh pros and cons, we scrutinize. But when we hear a story, we let our guard down. We're not being told what to think. We're being shown a world and invited to feel it. That soft entry is what makes stories so effective. Of course, like any persuasive tool, narrative can be used for good or for manipulation. Stories can distort as easily as they can clarify. A well-told anecdote can make a weak idea seem compelling. One emotional account can make us forget that it's not the whole picture. That's why it's important to pause and ask, is this one person's experience, or does it represent something broader? But rejecting stories entirely would mean ignoring one of the most ancient and effective ways we make sense of the world. Humans are storytelling animals. Before we had books, science, or spreadsheets, we had myths, parables, and shared memories. Stories help us remember. They help us care. To think critically in a story-driven world, you don't need to resist the story. You need to see it. Ask yourself, what is this story trying to make me feel? What is it trying to make me believe? That kind of reflection won't break the spell, but it will give you space to understand what the spell is doing. Because in the end, facts may win arguments, but stories win hearts. And sometimes, that's what changes everything. Conformity. You walk into a room where a group of people is taking a test. The questions seem straightforward, simple visual comparisons. But after a few rounds, something strange happens. Everyone in the group starts giving the same, obviously, wrong answer. You pause. You know it's incorrect, but now you're unsure. Are you missing something? Should you go along with them? You hesitate. And then you say the same wrong answer too. This isn't a hypothetical. It's a real experiment, one of the most famous in psychology, designed to test the power of conformity. In the 1950s, researcher Solomon Asch showed how ordinary people, when placed in a group where everyone else intentionally gave wrong answers, would often conform, even when they knew the group was wrong. The pressure wasn't overt. No one threatened or rewarded them. It was simply the quiet, invisible pull of wanting to fit in. Conformity is one of the most powerful social forces we experience. It's the instinct to match our behavior, beliefs, or appearance to those around us. And most of the time, it operates without us even realizing it. From the clothes we wear, to the words we use, to the opinions we share in a group, conformity shapes much of how we move through the world. Psychologists identify two main types of conformity. The first is normative conformity, which is driven by a desire to be liked or accepted. This is the reason we laugh at jokes we don't find funny, or agree with a group to avoid being the odd one out. The second is informational conformity, which is driven by a belief that the group might actually know better. This happens when we're unsure or insecure about a situation, and we assume that others have more accurate knowledge. Social media has amplified both types dramatically. Platforms reward trends, repetition, and group alignment. You see a certain opinion gaining thousands of likes or retweets. You weren't sure what you thought before, but now it seems obvious. You change your mind, or stay silent, or post something just to match the tone of what's safe to say. Conformity isn't forced, it's rewarded. Let's take this into an everyday setting. You're in a meeting at work. A proposal is being discussed. You're not convinced it's the right move, but everyone else is nodding in agreement. One person praises the idea. Another builds on it. You feel that twinge of hesitation. Should you speak up? Should you challenge it? Or should you just smile and move on? You choose the latter, not because you changed your mind, but because going against the group felt uncomfortable. That's conformity. It doesn't change what you know, it changes what you show. The effects of conformity aren't always negative. It's a glue that holds societies together. It helps us learn social norms, cooperate in groups, and reduce conflict. A degree of conformity allows people to live in shared spaces without chaos. But when conformity becomes automatic, when we stop thinking critically or suppress our own perspectives just to fit in, it becomes a barrier to progress, creativity, and honesty. This is especially risky when group norms are toxic, biased, or simply wrong. History offers many examples: groups going along with harmful ideologies, unethical decisions, or dangerous practices because no one wanted to be the dissenter. The logic becomes circular. Everyone agrees, so I must be wrong. And if I speak out, I'll be alone. That fear silences individuals who might otherwise speak truth. It takes courage to resist conformity, but that courage begins with awareness. The next time you agree with a group, pause and ask yourself, do I truly believe this? Or am I just trying not to stand out? That question doesn't mean you have to rebel. It simply means you're choosing consciously, not automatically. Because fitting in can feel safe, but thinking for yourself is what makes you free. Authority bias. You're in a hospital waiting room. A man in a white coat enters and speaks with confidence. You assume he's a doctor. He tells you to fill out a form, then suggests a specific treatment. You don't ask if he's licensed or whether he's actually a doctor. You just nod. He looks the part. He sounds like he knows what he's doing. So you follow. This is authority bias in action, the tendency to attribute greater accuracy, credibility, or value to the opinions of someone we perceive as an authority figure, even when it's not deserved. It's the quiet voice in your head that says, they must be right, they're in charge. And it's one of the most deeply rooted biases we carry. Authority bias isn't irrational. Throughout human history, trusting those in positions of knowledge or leadership helped us survive. If the village elder said the berries were poisonous, you believed it. If the commander said charge, you followed. Questioning authority in the wrong moment could mean danger or exile. So we evolved, with a natural deference to those who seem to know better. But today, that instinct often operates where real trust hasn't been earned. We defer not just to experts, but to the appearance of expertise. Uniforms, job titles, confidence, a polished voice. Even subtle cues like posture or tone can trigger this bias. And once activated, we're more likely to accept claims without scrutiny, overlook errors, and follow instructions, even when they go against our own judgment. The most famous example of authority bias in psychology comes from the Milgram experiment. In the 1960s, participants were instructed by a man in a lab coat to administer electric shocks to another person, who they believed was a real volunteer, each time a wrong answer was given. The shocks weren't real, but the participants didn't know that. Despite hearing screams of pain, most people continued to deliver the shocks when told to do so by the experimenter. Why? Because he looked official. He spoke calmly. He carried the authority of science. That was enough. Authority bias also shows up in everyday settings, often quietly. In meetings, people are less likely to challenge the boss, even if they disagree. In classrooms, students may accept flawed reasoning from teachers without question. On social media, accounts with verified badges or thousands of followers are often treated as more credible, regardless of what they're saying. And in medicine, patients frequently follow doctors' orders without fully understanding the risks, because asking questions can feel like disobedience. Let's look at a situation that might feel familiar. You're in a financial planning session. The advisor speaks quickly, uses jargon you don't fully understand, and moves confidently through charts and options. You're not sure about some of the suggestions, but you nod along anyway. You sign the documents, trusting they know what's best. Days later, you realize you didn't ask half the questions you meant to. You weren't convinced, you were intimidated. That's authority bias. It didn't come from pressure, it came from perception. What makes authority bias especially tricky is that it feels responsible. Trusting experts seems like the smart thing to do, and sometimes it is. But problems arise when we stop asking questions, or when we confuse status with knowledge. Not every person in power is competent, and not every confident voice is correct. To protect yourself from this bias, practice slow thinking in the presence of authority. Don't be afraid to pause, clarify, or ask for a second opinion. Remind yourself, respecting someone's position doesn't mean suspending my judgment. A good expert welcomes questions. A true leader explains, rather than commands, because blind obedience might feel efficient, but thoughtful questioning is how we protect our autonomy. Decoy Effect. You're at the movies, standing in front of the concession stand. The small popcorn costs $3, the large is $7, but there's also a medium for $6.50. Suddenly, the large seems like a much better deal. For just 50 cents more, you get way more popcorn. So, you pick the large. What you don't realize is this: you weren't deciding between small and large. You were reacting to the presence of the medium, and that's exactly what it was there for. This is the decoy effect, a cognitive bias that causes people to change their preference between two options when a third, less appealing option is introduced. The decoy isn't meant to be chosen. It's meant to make one of the other two options look much more attractive by comparison. Marketers use this all the time, especially when pricing products. Let's say you're deciding between two subscription plans, one basic, one premium. Maybe you're unsure, leaning toward basic because it's cheaper. Then a third plan appears, right between the two. It's only slightly cheaper than the premium, but with significantly fewer features. Now, the premium plan seems like a smart, high-value choice. Nothing about the premium changed, but the way you perceive it did. The decoy effect works because humans are terrible at evaluating value in isolation. We don't often ask, is this worth the price on its own? Instead, we compare. And, in comparisons, context is everything. The decoy gives us a new context. It subtly reshapes how we judge the other options, anchoring us toward what the seller wants us to pick. It's important to understand that this effect doesn't just influence pricing. It shows up in how we choose restaurants, electronics, travel packages, and even people. In dating apps, for instance, you might feel drawn to someone not because of their profile alone, but because the previous one seemed much less appealing. The contrast enhances the impression. We don't just like things, we like them more than something else. Let's ground this in a familiar example. You're shopping for a new tablet. One model is $299 with decent features. Another is $499 with a better screen, faster processor, and more storage. It feels expensive. Then you see a third version, priced at $479 with the same screen as the cheaper model and half the storage of the expensive one. Suddenly, the $499 model feels like a steal. It wasn't your first choice, but now it seems obvious. What changed wasn't your need. It was the lineup. This tactic is so effective that it's taught in business schools and built into pricing strategies across industries. Online platforms structure their plans deliberately: basic, standard, and best value. That middle tier, the decoy, isn't there to compete. It's there to push you toward the top. And it works, often without us noticing. The key feature of a decoy is asymmetry. It's not a random third choice. It's designed to be clearly worse than one option and not meaningfully better than the other. It makes the target look smart, rational, and balanced. You feel like you're making an informed decision, when in reality, you've been gently steered. To resist the decoy effect, slow down the comparison process. Ask yourself, if this third option weren't here, which one would I choose? Remove the decoy mentally. Rethink the decision based on your actual needs, not how things are framed. It also helps to zoom out. Do you even need the top-tier product? Or are you reacting to how it's being presented? Many upsells, especially in tech and travel, rely on the illusion of value through contrast, not real functionality. Because when every option is placed to guide your choice, the question isn't which one is best. The real question is, who decided what your options should look like in the first place? False dilemma: you're watching a debate and one speaker says, we either raise taxes or we let the economy collapse. There is no other way. It's a dramatic statement, clear, urgent, and easy to remember. But there's a problem. It's a false dilemma. The speaker has presented two extreme options and erased everything in between. And yet, to the audience, it feels like those are the only choices that exist. The false dilemma, also known as the false dichotomy, is a logical fallacy where a complex situation is framed as having only two possible outcomes. It simplifies reality into a binary, this or that, right or wrong, with us or against us. And the more emotionally charged the context, the more effective the illusion becomes. Politicians use this tactic often. It allows them to reduce debates into sides, to rally supporters by creating an enemy. Either we tighten our borders, or we risk total chaos. Either you support this policy, or you don't care about safety. These statements don't invite discussion. They shut it down. They make it seem like any alternative is either naive or dangerous. But the false dilemma isn't just a tool of rhetoric. It's something we internalize in our own lives. You might think, either I succeed at this job or I've failed at life. Or, either I forgive them completely or I cut them out forever. These mental traps don't reflect the full picture. They reflect the emotional pressure to make decisions quickly, with certainty. And certainty often feels safer than complexity. Marketers also use false dilemmas. Buy this now, or miss out forever. Switch today, or stay stuck. These aren't real threats. They're psychological nudges, framed to eliminate nuance and accelerate decision-making. By making the alternative sound unacceptable, the offered path feels like the only rational one. Let's take a closer look at a common example. Imagine a fitness app tells you, you can either commit to your health today or keep making excuses. On the surface, it sounds motivational, but underneath, it sets a false frame. What about people trying in small steps? What about those facing mental or physical limitations? The message isn't wrong because health is unimportant. It's wrong because it denies the middle ground. It forces a choice between perfection and failure, and that's not how real life works. The power of false dilemmas lies in their simplicity. Humans crave clarity. In a world full of uncertainty, being told there are only two doors, one good, one bad, feels comforting. It's easier to act when you believe there's only one correct path. That's why this bias is so often used in persuasive messaging, political discourse, and even in relationships. If you loved me, you would do this. If you don't agree with me, you must be against me. But real decisions usually aren't binary. They exist on a spectrum. There are trade-offs, alternatives, compromises, and the danger of falling for false dilemmas is that you might reject perfectly reasonable middle paths simply because they weren't presented. To recognize and resist this effect, ask yourself one simple question. Are there really only two options here? Often, just asking that cracks open a wider perspective. Could there be a third choice? Could I take a smaller step? Could I delay the decision until I have more information? The moment you make space for possibility, the illusion begins to fall apart because the world rarely divides into black and white, and the truth usually lives in the grey areas in between. Illusion of choice. You walk into a coffee shop and see the menu. Tall, grand, or venti. 3 sizes, 3 prices. It feels like you're in control. You get to choose what fits your needs and budget. But then you notice something strange. The grande and venti cost nearly the same, and the small size isn't even mentioned in the promotion. Suddenly, you're nudged toward the large. You had a choice. But did you really? This is the illusion of choice. A cognitive bias where people believe they're making free, informed decisions, when in fact, the options presented are deliberately structured to lead them in a specific direction. It's not just about having choices. It's about how those choices are framed, limited, or manipulated to give the appearance of freedom while quietly guiding behavior. The illusion of choice is everywhere. In politics, you may be offered 2 candidates with near identical policies. In cable plans, you might see 5 tiers, 3 of which are designed to steer you toward the middle one labeled best value. In online forms, you may be asked to accept all or manage preferences, knowing full well that the second option leads you down a maze of checkboxes designed to exhaust you into compliance. Psychologically, we crave autonomy. We want to feel like we're in charge of our decisions. That's why choice architecture, how options are structured, has become a major tool in advertising, technology, and behavioral economics. When people feel like they're choosing, they're more likely to commit. But when the environment has been engineered to favor one outcome, that feeling becomes a performance. Let's explore a relatable example. You're buying a new phone. The company offers 3 models: Basic, Pro, and Pro Max. The Basic is missing some standard features, almost unusable for your needs. The Pro Max is wildly expensive, clearly aimed at enthusiasts. That leaves the Pro. It's not cheap, but it feels reasonable in comparison. So you buy it. But that was never an accident. The company never expected to sell many Basics or Pro Maxes. They're there to make the Pro feel like the smart, balanced choice you chose, but they designed your path. The illusion of choice also plays out in entertainment. Streaming platforms give you thousands of options, but the homepage shows you only a curated few. Algorithms decide what's trending, what's top picks for you, and what shows up first. You scroll, you choose, and you believe it was your idea. But your attention was guided, narrowed, and influenced long before you pressed play. In education, students might be told, you can choose your electives, but the options are pre-selected from a limited list. In job applications, companies offer flexibility, but with predefined roles and paths. In public policy, citizens may vote on policies that were drafted behind closed doors. You make a choice, but you didn't shape the menu. The effect is most dangerous when it becomes invisible, when people mistake selection for agency. Just because you picked something doesn't mean it was your preference. It might have been the least bad of constrained options, or it might have been placed where you were most likely to click. That's not choice, it's design disguised as freedom. To resist this bias, ask yourself, who created these options? What alternatives are missing? Would I still choose this if more paths were available? The moment you ask that, you move from passive chooser to active evaluator. You stop just reacting to a system and start seeing the system itself, because freedom of choice is only real when the choices are real. Call to action bias. You finish reading an article, and at the end it says, share this if you agree. You weren't planning to. You didn't think the content was that remarkable. But the sentence lingers in your mind. You hover over the button. You click. One tiny nudge, one small sentence, and suddenly you've taken an action you didn't intend. This is the call to action bias, the subtle psychological push that happens when we're prompted to act in specific ways, especially when those prompts are designed to feel natural, polite, or helpful. It's not a demand, it's not a threat, it's a whisper. You should do this. And when the timing and language are right, that whisper works. Marketers use calls to action constantly. Subscribe for more. Don't miss out. Click here. Join the movement. These phrases are everywhere, from YouTube videos to emails to mobile apps. They don't just ask, they direct. And because they're phrased as friendly suggestions, we rarely recognize them as persuasive tools. The key lies in how automatic the response becomes. The more familiar the command, the less it feels like manipulation. But it's not just in advertising. Calls to action are embedded in digital design. Buttons are colored to stand out. Pop-ups appear with countdowns or blinking, yes, I'm interested options, paired with a dull grey, no, I'll miss this chance alternative. The language is structured to make saying yes feel aligned and saying no feel like failure. Even headlines play this game. Compare. Here's why you should start meditating today with The Science of Meditation. One invites you to learn, the other tells you what to do. The structure changes your mental posture. You're not just reading, you're being led. Let's take a closer look at a situation you've likely seen. You're watching a video. At the halfway point, the narrator says, if you've made it this far, you're clearly interested. Why not hit the like button? It feels casual, fair even. You are still watching. So, you click. Not because you were moved, but because the call made your continued presence feel like silent agreement. The button became a reflex, not a decision. This tactic becomes even more persuasive when combined with urgency. Act now. Only a few hours left. Secure your spot. Today. These phrases don't just suggest, they tap into scarcity, pressure, and FOMO. They frame inaction as loss. And in the face of potential loss, most people act, sometimes without questioning why they're being pushed in the first place. Social causes and political movements use this too. Add your name. Take a stand. Don't stay silent. These calls often come with emotional framing, making action feel like a moral imperative. Refusal becomes more than disinterest. It becomes disloyalty. And that emotional pressure is exactly what gives the message power. The call to action bias is especially effective because it feels empowering. You're taking action. You're doing something. But the problem arises when that action wasn't chosen consciously. It was triggered. And when every piece of content ends with like, share, comment, subscribe, it's easy to forget that you can simply do nothing. To stay mindful, ask yourself, do I want to do this? Or am I just responding to the prompt? Take a breath before clicking, before signing up, before joining. Consider if the suggestion aligns with your real interests, or if it was just well-timed and well-worded. Because there's a difference between acting and being acted upon. And the best decisions are made with intention, not with buttons blinking in your face. Loss aversion. Imagine someone offers you a simple bet. Flip a coin. If it lands heads, you win $100. Tails, you lose $100. Most people hesitate. Some decline. Now imagine the offer changes. If it's heads, you win $150. Tails, you still lose $100. The odds are in your favor now, but it still feels risky. Why? Because for most of us, the pain of losing something is psychologically stronger than the pleasure of gaining the same thing. This is loss aversion, a core principle in behavioral economics that explains why we are more motivated to avoid losses than to pursue equivalent gains. It's not just a bias, it's a deeply wired instinct. This idea was popularized by psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. In their research, they found that people consistently react more strongly to potential losses than to similar or even larger potential gains. The emotional impact of losing $100 is far greater than the joy of gaining $100. As a result, we often make decisions not to maximize rewards, but to minimize regret. Loss aversion shapes how we invest, how we shop, how we vote, and how we build relationships. It explains why people stay in bad jobs or unhealthy relationships, because the idea of losing stability feels worse than the possibility of gaining happiness. It's also why we hold on to things we no longer use: clothes, gadgets, subscriptions, just because we once paid for them. In marketing, loss aversion is everywhere. Don't miss out. Only 3 seats left. You're about to lose your progress. These messages don't promise rewards. They highlight what you might lose. And because our brains treat loss like danger, we react quickly. We click, we buy, we commit, often without asking if we even needed the thing in the first place. Let's step into a realistic scenario. You've been using a free trial for a fitness app. A notification pops up. Your personalized plan will be deleted in 24 hours unless you subscribe. You weren't planning to pay, but now it feels like you're losing something you built, even if you haven't used it much. You subscribe. Not because you're excited about the features, but because you don't want to lose what you feel like you already own. That feeling is called the Endowment Effect, a close cousin of loss aversion. Once we believe something belongs to us, even briefly, giving it up feels painful. Loss aversion also fuels our risk avoidance in decision-making. In investing, for instance, people will often hold on to losing stocks for too long, not wanting to lock in the loss, while quickly selling winning stocks to take profits. It feels safer. But ironically, that instinct often leads to worse financial outcomes. In relationships and negotiations, we see the same pattern. People will sometimes agree to unfair terms just to avoid losing a deal. Or they'll refuse to compromise, not because they expect a better result, but because giving something up feels like weakness. The fear of losing becomes more powerful than the desire to improve. To manage loss aversion, it helps to reframe decisions. Instead of asking, "What might I lose?" try asking, "What might I gain if I let go?" Consider opportunity cost, not just what you're losing, but what staying stuck is costing you. Sometimes, what feels like loss is actually space being cleared for something better. And remember, not every loss is dangerous. Not every letting go is failure. In truth, clinging to what we already have, just because we fear the feeling of losing, is one of the biggest ways we stay small, safe, and stuck. Because life isn't just about holding on. Sometimes, it's about learning what's truly worth keeping. Cognitive dissonance. You buy an expensive fitness tracker. A week later, you realize you barely use it. Deep down, you know it wasn't a necessary purchase. But instead of admitting that, you find yourself saying, well, it motivates me just by being on my wrist. You've changed the meaning of the purchase, not to fool others, but to convince yourself. That moment is cognitive dissonance. The discomfort we feel when our actions, beliefs, or values contradict each other. Rather than sit in that discomfort, we resolve it by changing one side of the equation, how we think, how we justify, or how we remember. It's not lying. It's emotional balance. The theory was first introduced by psychologist Leon Festinger in the 1950s. He discovered that people will go to surprising lengths to maintain internal consistency. When reality doesn't match the image we hold of ourselves, we feel tension. And the brain doesn't like tension. It wants alignment, even if that means bending logic or memory just a little. One classic study involved participants who performed a boring task for an hour, then were paid either $1 or $20 to lie and say it was enjoyable. Strangely, those paid only $1 later reported genuinely liking the task more. Why? Because the $1 wasn't enough to justify lying. To resolve that internal conflict, they convinced themselves they weren't lying at all. They truly enjoyed it. That's how powerful dissonance can be. In everyday life, cognitive dissonance shows up everywhere. A person who smokes but values health might say, "It helps me manage stress." Someone who prides themselves on honesty but tells a small lie might rationalize it with, "It was for their own good." We adjust our beliefs to match our behavior, not always consciously, but reliably. Let's look at a familiar example. You've committed to a job you don't enjoy. You're overworked, underpaid, and mentally drained. But when someone asks how things are going, you respond, "It's busy, but I'm learning a lot." That statement might be true in part, but it's also a shield. You're protecting yourself from the sting of feeling stuck. Instead of facing the contradiction, "I don't like this, but I'm staying," you soften the edges. You make the situation make sense. We do this in relationships too. We may stay with someone who mistreats us, but reframe it. They're going through a lot. We invest time, money, or energy into a project we no longer believe in, but tell ourselves, "I've already come this far." That's the sunk cost fallacy combined with dissonance. We stay not because it's right, but because leaving would create emotional chaos. Marketers and political strategists understand this well. After making a public decision, like posting, support for a cause, or buying a brand, people often double down, even in the face of new information. Why? Because changing direction would mean admitting they might have been wrong, and being wrong threatens identity. Cognitive dissonance isn't weakness, it's human, but if left unchecked, it can keep us locked in bad patterns. We avoid difficult truths, rewrite past events, or justify behaviors that no longer serve us, not because we're dishonest, but because self-coherence feels safer than contradiction. To work through dissonance, the key is curiosity over defense. When you catch yourself justifying, ask, what belief is this protecting? What would happen if I let myself feel the tension instead of resolving it immediately? Discomfort isn't always a signal to fix something. Sometimes it's a signal to listen more closely. Because peace of mind doesn't always come from making the discomfort go away. Sometimes it comes from being honest enough to sit with it and still keep going. Endowment effect. You're cleaning out your closet. At the back, you find a shirt you haven't worn in years. It doesn't fit well and it's out of style. Still, you hesitate. Maybe I'll wear it again, you think. You place it back, on the hanger. If someone else offered you the same shirt at a store, you'd walk right past it. But now that it's yours, it somehow feels more valuable. This is the endowment effect, a cognitive bias where we place a higher value on things we own than on things we don't. Ownership changes our perception. What was once just another item becomes something harder to part with. And this shift isn't based on utility or demand. It's based on attachment, however subtle. The endowment effect is deeply linked to loss aversion. Giving something up feels like losing part of ourselves, even if we didn't care much for it before. Once something is in our possession, even temporarily, we begin to view it differently. It becomes an extension of our identity, our memories, our effort. In one study, participants were given mugs and asked to assign a price if they wanted to sell them. Others, who weren't given mugs, were asked how much they'd pay to buy one. On average, those who owned the mug valued it nearly twice as high as those who didn't. Nothing changed about the object, only who held it first. This effect shows up in countless areas of life. In negotiations, sellers often demand more for their products than buyers are willing to pay. Not because the product is objectively worth more, but because it feels that way when you own it. In real estate, homeowners often overprice their houses, convinced that others will see the value they do. In sports and collectibles, people overestimate the worth of items they've held onto for years, believing emotional history adds real-world value. Let's look at a simple, familiar example. You're browsing an online marketplace and spot a used chair. It's $30. You hesitate. It looks worn, but now imagine you own that same chair and are listing it for sale. You price it at $75. Why? It's solid, you say. It's held up well. I bought it new. It's got character. None of that mattered when you were the buyer. But now you're the seller. The shift in ownership changed your expectations. Not because the item changed, but because your role did. The endowment effect also appears in digital spaces. Ever notice how you're more reluctant to cancel a free trial after you've started using it? Or how deleting saved playlists, characters in a game, or old posts can feel like a loss? Once we've customized, curated, or interacted with something, we begin to think of it as ours, and letting go becomes harder, even when logic says otherwise. It can even show up in relationships and routines. You might cling to a habit just because it's your way of doing things, even if it's no longer working. Or you might resist switching tools or workflows, not because the new option is worse, but because you've invested time and effort into the old one. That investment creates a false sense of value, as if your past choices must be preserved. To work through this bias, start by separating emotional ownership from actual need. Ask yourself, would I buy this today if I didn't already own it? If this belonged to someone else, would I still think it's worth the same? These small reframes help loosen the grip of false value. Because not everything we own is worth what we think. Sometimes, we're just holding on to the feeling of having something that once felt like ours. Confirmation bias. You see a headline that aligns perfectly with what you already think. New study confirms your opinion. Without hesitation, you click, read, and maybe even share it. But the next day, you come across a study that says the opposite. You skim it, question the source, and move on. It doesn't feel convincing. It doesn't feel true. Why? This is confirmation bias. The tendency to search for, interpret, and remember information in a way that confirms what we already believe. It doesn't matter how intelligent or informed we are. The moment our brain latches onto a belief, it starts filtering reality to protect it. Evidence that supports our view feels stronger. Evidence that challenges it feels suspicious, flawed, or easy to ignore. This bias operates beneath awareness. It affects how we read articles, watch videos, interpret facial expressions, and recall past experiences. It influences who we trust, who we listen to, and how we engage in conversation. And the more emotionally attached we are to a belief, the stronger the bias becomes. One famous experiment illustrates this perfectly. Two groups of participants were shown the same mixed evidence about capital punishment. One group supported it, the other opposed it. After reading, each side reported that the data confirmed their position and that the opposing arguments were weak. The same evidence led to stronger polarization. Not because of logic, but because of selective perception. In a digital world, confirmation bias becomes even more dangerous. Algorithms feed us what we already like, believe, or agree with. Social media bubbles form, echo chambers where the same ideas are repeated, reinforced, and rarely challenged. Over time, we're not just believing our version of reality, we're surrounded by it. And anything outside that bubble feels not just wrong, but threatening. Let's consider a daily life example. You believe your coworker doesn't like you. One day, they pass by without saying hello. You note it silently. Proof, you think. Later, they compliment your work in a meeting. You smile politely but think, they're probably just being professional. Your mind holds onto the cold silence but discounts the warm praise. You're not lying to yourself. You're just letting belief filter experience. Confirmation bias also shows up in relationships. When we think someone loves us, we interpret neutral actions as caring. When we suspect someone's losing interest, the same actions feel cold. The behavior hasn't changed. Our lens has. Marketers and political groups know how powerful this is. They craft messages that reinforce what audiences already think. Finally, someone said it. We all know this is true. These phrases don't introduce new ideas. They validate old ones. And validation feels good. It feels like certainty. But there's a hidden cost. When we only consume information that supports us, we stop learning. We stop adjusting. We stop asking questions. Instead of growing, we dig in. And the more we dig, the harder it becomes to admit we might be wrong. 2. Break free from confirmation bias. You don't need to doubt everything you believe. You just need to develop the habit of asking, what would I think if this supported the opposite side? What evidence would change my mind? If the answer is nothing, that's a sign you're no longer reasoning. You're protecting. Growth doesn't come from always being right. It comes from being willing to reconsider, even when it's uncomfortable. Because the truth isn't afraid of questions. But bias is. The halo effect. You meet someone at a party. They're well-dressed, charming, and confident. Within minutes, you find yourself thinking they must be intelligent, successful, maybe even kind. But none of those things were proven. They were assumed. You didn't evaluate each trait. You let one positive impression color everything else. This is the halo effect, a psychological bias where our overall impression of a person, product, or organization influences how we feel about their unrelated qualities. When we notice one good trait, we tend to assume the rest are just as positive. The halo spreads, casting everything in a flattering light, whether or not it's earned. The term was first coined by psychologist Edward Thorndike in the 1920s. In a study of military officers, he found that when superiors rated soldiers as physically attractive, they were also more likely to rate them as more disciplined, intelligent, and competent, even if there was no evidence for those traits. The initial positive impression distorted the rest of the evaluation. This happens constantly in daily life. We assume attractive people are more trustworthy. We believe charismatic speakers are better leaders. We think brands with sleek design make better products. We rate popular influencers as more credible, even when they're talking outside their expertise. A good first impression can carry far more weight than we realize. Let's look at a simple, relatable example. You're browsing book reviews online. One book has a beautifully designed cover and a catchy title. Another has a bland design. Without reading a word, you're already leaning toward the first one. When you start reading the blurbs, the praise for the first book feels more convincing. Even minor flaws are easier to overlook. The second book may be just as good, or better, but the first book is wearing a halo. Your expectations have been shaped by surface impressions. The halo effect also explains why we sometimes stay blind to red flags. If we admire someone for their intelligence or success, we may dismiss bad behavior as just part of the package. If we love a brand, we may ignore ethical issues because we associate them with quality. Our positive perception doesn't just influence what we see, it changes what we're willing to excuse. In relationships, this effect can be just as powerful. Early in dating, if someone is funny or attractive, we may assume they're emotionally mature or compatible, traits that take time to observe. This can lead to confusion down the road when the person's behavior doesn't align with the image we created. It's not that they changed, it's that we filled in too many blanks too soon. Marketing and branding thrive on this bias. Companies know that design, celebrity endorsements, or a good origin story can create a powerful halo. A product that feels premium might get better reviews, even when it performs the same as a cheaper one. The glow of perceived quality can blur the details. To recognize when the halo effect is influencing you, pause and ask, am I judging this based on one strong trait? If I didn't know this part, would I still feel the same about the rest? Try separating the surface from the substance. It doesn't mean becoming cynical, it means seeing clearly, because admiration is easy, but discernment takes practice. Anchoring bias in numbers. You're shopping for a new laptop. The first one you see costs $2,000. It's more than you planned, so you keep looking. Soon, you find a similar model for $1,400. Now, it feels like a bargain, even though $1,400 is still a significant amount. That initial $2,000 price set a mental anchor, and everything after was judged in its shadow. This is anchoring bias, specifically in numerical contexts. A cognitive bias where the first number we see becomes a reference point, shaping how we interpret future information. The anchor doesn't need to be accurate. It just needs to be first. Once it's set, it pulls everything else toward it, even when we know it shouldn't. This effect is so powerful that it influences decisions in areas like pricing, salary negotiations, budgets, and even charitable giving. When we're unsure about value or scale, we grab onto the first number we see as a guide, even if that number is arbitrary or irrelevant. One famous study demonstrated this using a roulette wheel. Participants spun a wheel rigged to land on either a high or low number. Then they were asked to estimate how many African countries are in the United Nations. Those who got high numbers gave higher estimates. Those with low numbers guessed lower. The wheel had nothing to do with the question, but it set the anchor. The number stuck. In real life, anchoring plays out in more subtle ways. Let's say you're told the average salary for a role is $60,000. Suddenly, that becomes your benchmark. Even if the range is much wider, you now view offers above that as generous, and those below it as disappointing. Your expectations have been quietly boxed in. Let's walk through a familiar situation. You're booking a hotel. The first option you see is a luxury suite for $400 a night. You keep scrolling and find a smaller room for $220. Compared to the suite, it feels reasonable, almost cheap. But is $220 cheap for a hotel night? Maybe not. The point is, your perception wasn't based on market value. It was based on the first number. That anchor is now driving your sense of value. Anchoring is also used in sales techniques. A salesperson might start by showing you the most expensive item, something you were never going to buy. Then, when they show you a mid-range option, it feels more reasonable by contrast. The high anchor wasn't about making a sale, it was about setting a frame. In fundraising, this bias is weaponized with donation prompts. Would you like to give $500, $250, $100, or enter your own amount? That top number is often unrealistic for most people, but it makes $100 feel small, doable, even generous. The first number was never expected. It was designed to nudge. Anchoring bias isn't limited to money. It also affects how we think about time, risk, and performance. If your boss tells you the last person in your role made 60 sales a month, you'll use that number to measure your success, regardless of whether it fits your context. The number becomes a lens, and lenses change what we see. So how do we defend against anchoring? The first step is recognizing it. Ask yourself, where did this number come from? Am I evaluating this based on what I need, or just comparing it to? The first thing I saw, try seeking multiple sources before forming a judgment. The more data points you have, the weaker any single anchor becomes. Because in a world filled with numbers, the first one isn't always the right one, but it's often the one that decides how we think about the rest. Emotional reasoning. You wake up feeling anxious. There's no clear reason, but the sensation is heavy. You check your calendar, just meetings and errands, nothing unusual. Still, a quiet thought slips in. Something must be wrong. The feeling becomes the evidence, and before long, you're treating emotion like truth. This is emotional reasoning, the mental shortcut where we assume that what we feel must reflect objective reality. If we feel insecure, we think we must be doing something wrong. If we feel overwhelmed, we conclude life is falling apart. If we feel angry, we assume someone else is to blame. But feelings, powerful as they are, aren't always accurate reflections of the world around us. This bias stems from how tightly emotion is woven into thought. Our brains evolved to treat emotions as signals. Fear might mean danger. Sadness might mean loss. Joy might mean something is working. In many cases, that's helpful. But when emotions become our primary decision-making tool, unchecked by reflection, they distort rather than clarify. Cognitive behavioral therapy often highlights emotional reasoning as one of the key patterns that drive anxiety, depression, and impulsive choices. People stuck in emotional reasoning loops may say things like, "I feel worthless, so I must be," or "I feel like this will fail, so it probably will." The emotion becomes proof, even when no external evidence supports it. Let's bring this into a familiar situation. You're giving a presentation. Halfway through, you notice your heart pounding. You feel nervous. Then you think, everyone can tell. I'm doing badly. They probably think I'm unprepared. But in reality, no one has reacted. Some are nodding. A few are taking notes. The performance is fine. But your feeling hijacked your interpretation. That's emotional reasoning. It's not the crowd that made you think you were failing. It was the fear that convinced you it must be true. This bias doesn't just affect internal dialogue, it affects relationships. If you feel hurt during an argument, you might believe the other person meant to hurt you. If you feel distant from a friend, you might assume they've pulled away, even if they're just overwhelmed themselves. Your emotional state becomes the narrative, and anything that doesn't match it is either ignored or reshaped to fit. Media and social platforms can amplify this tendency. Sensational headlines provoke fear or outrage, and people often share them not because they're verified, but because they feel true. In a world where emotion spreads faster than analysis, emotional reasoning becomes contagious. Outrage becomes fact. Discomfort becomes a judgment. It can even show up in how we process news about ourselves. A single critical comment online can ruin your mood for hours, even if it's drowned out by dozens of compliments. You don't think, one person disagreed. You think, they must be right. The hurt becomes the verdict. The feeling becomes the filter. So how do we step back from emotional reasoning? It starts with separating how you feel from what you know. Ask yourself, what is the evidence? Are there facts to support this? Or is it just my state of mind right now? You're not dismissing the emotion. You're checking whether it matches reality. Emotions matter, but they're not infallible guides. Sometimes they're just weather systems, temporary, shifting, and beyond your control. Building that pause between emotion and interpretation is a skill. It doesn't silence your feelings. It gives them space to speak without letting them dictate the whole story. Because just because something feels true doesn't mean it is. Availability, heuristic. You hear about a plane crash on the news. The footage is dramatic. Flames, wreckage, a reporter on site. For days, the image stays in your mind. A week later, you're booking a flight, and a thought creeps in. Is this really safe? You hesitate. Statistically, flying is far safer than driving, but it doesn't feel that way. Why? This is the availability heuristic, a mental shortcut where we judge the likelihood of events based on how easily examples come to mind. The more vivid, emotional, or recent the example, the more likely we believe it is, even if the statistics say otherwise. We confuse memorable with common. The brain evolved to rely on this shortcut for efficiency. In uncertain situations, it makes sense to respond to what's top of mind. If you recently saw someone get bitten by a snake, It's rational to be more cautious around tall grass. But in the modern world, where media constantly feeds us striking, unusual events, the heuristic can distort our sense of reality. This bias affects how we assess risks, make decisions, and form opinions. After hearing about a violent crime on TV, people often overestimate crime rates. After watching news about a natural disaster, people may feel like such events are more frequent than they are. Our emotional memory becomes our measuring stick. Let's consider a familiar moment. You're scrolling social media and see a video of a child falling off a swing. It's a little scary, but also viral. The comments are full of panic. Later that week, you take your niece to the playground. As she runs to the swings, you pause. You feel nervous. You say, "Let's play somewhere else." You're not responding to actual data about danger. You're reacting to a video that burned itself into your mind. The video was rare but vivid. And in your brain, vivid feels true. Marketers and news outlets know how to harness this effect. Headlines that provoke fear or awe tend to be shared more often, which means they stay in circulation longer and stay in our minds. Emotional stories outperform dry statistics. A single dramatic anecdote can shape public opinion more than an entire dataset. The problem isn't that the story is false, it's that it becomes the only story we remember. This also shows up in how we perceive ourselves. If we recall a few embarrassing moments in a social setting, we might conclude we're awkward, ignoring the dozens of interactions that went fine. If we think of 2 failed attempts at learning something, we may say, "I'm just not good at this," forgetting how common early failure is. The most available memories become the foundation of our beliefs, even if they're exceptions. The availability heuristic can also affect decision-making in groups. After a single negative incident with a customer, a team might overhaul its entire service policy, even if the issue was a fluke. After hearing about one bad investment, someone might avoid investing altogether. One dramatic memory overrides 100 uneventful ones. To protect yourself from this bias, ask, is this fear based on frequency or on vividness? Am I reacting to what's likely or to what's loudest in my head? Try seeking data instead of anecdotes. Widen the lens beyond the most memorable moment, because just because something comes to mind quickly doesn't mean it happens often. Overconfidence bias. You're taking a quiz. You breeze through the questions, feeling sure of your answers. At the end, you're confident you nailed at least 90%. But when the results come in, you've scored closer to 65%. You're surprised, not just by the result, but by how wrong your certainty was. That gap between how right we think we are and how right we actually are, that's overconfidence bias. Overconfidence bias is the tendency to overestimate our knowledge, our performance, and our ability to predict outcomes. It affects experts and amateurs alike, and it often feels empowering until reality pushes back. The problem isn't ambition, it's the illusion of precision, the sense that because we feel confident, we must be right. Psychologists have studied this effect for decades. In one experiment, participants were asked general knowledge questions and told to assign a confidence level to each answer. The average person who was 100% sure turned out to be correct only about 70–80% of the time. The pattern was clear. The more confident people felt, the more likely they were to overstep the truth. This bias doesn't come from arrogance, it comes from how the brain handles uncertainty. Confidence feels good. It reduces hesitation. It fuels action. In evolutionary terms, being confident helped us survive. But in modern life, where outcomes depend on complexity, nuance, and probabilities, that confidence can mislead us. Overconfidence shows up everywhere. In financial decisions, job interviews, forecasts, leadership, and even personal relationships. A person might say, "I know exactly what they're thinking," or "I guarantee this investment will pay off." These statements sound decisive, but they leave no room for error. And when they're wrong, the cost is often high. Let's consider a common situation. You're helping a friend move. They ask if everything will fit into your car. Without measuring, you say, absolutely. You're confident. It looks like it'll work. An hour later, you're rearranging boxes on the sidewalk, frustrated that it doesn't fit. You weren't trying to mislead. You simply assumed your confidence reflected the facts, but it didn't. It reflected your impression and your bias. In leadership, overconfidence can be especially dangerous. A manager might push a plan without feedback, convinced they've thought through everything. A politician may promise outcomes with absolute certainty, ignoring complexities. In both cases, confidence becomes a shield against doubt, when doubt might have led to better decisions. Even in daily conversations, we overstate what we know. We speak about topics we've read, one article about as if we're informed. We offer advice without knowing the full context. We underestimate how often we've been wrong before, because the feeling of being right is so convincing. But overconfidence doesn't just affect what we say. It shapes what we don't do. It can stop us from double-checking, from asking for help, from updating our beliefs. When we think we already know enough, we stop learning. And that's when the gap between confidence and competence quietly grows wider. So how do we manage it? Start by getting comfortable with uncertainty. Practice saying, I don't know, without shame. Before declaring something, ask, how sure am I really? Have I considered I could be wrong? When making decisions, consult data, seek feedback, and play devil's advocate with your own thinking. True confidence doesn't come from being always right. It comes from knowing when you might be wrong. Because real wisdom isn't loud, it's cautious, and it always leaves space for doubt. The spotlight effect. You spill coffee on your shirt just before walking into a room. All day, you feel like everyone is noticing. You imagine eyes lingering. You catch yourself adjusting your posture, covering the stain, trying to act normal. But here's the truth. Most people didn't see it. And those who did, they forgot within seconds. This is the spotlight effect, a psychological bias where we believe we're being observed and judged far more than we actually are. We assume a figurative spotlight is shining on us, highlighting our flaws, mistakes, or awkward moments. But in reality, everyone else is mostly focused on themselves. The spotlight effect is strongest during moments of perceived embarrassment, when we wear something different, speak in public, stumble over a word, or say something we regret. We imagine those moments being replayed in others' minds. But they're not. Most people are too busy worrying about their own spotlights. This idea was first studied by psychologist Thomas Gilovich and colleagues. In one experiment, participants were asked to wear an embarrassing t-shirt into a room of strangers. Afterwards, they were asked to estimate how many people noticed. The actual number was much lower than expected. The conclusion was clear. We consistently overestimate how much others notice and care about what we do. This effect is rooted in a simple truth. We are each the center of our own experience. We see the world from our own perspective, so it's natural to assume others are focused on us too. But they're not. They're thinking about themselves, just like we are. Let's look at a common situation. You're giving a short speech at a friend's birthday. Halfway through, you forget a line. You pause, stutter, then recover. Inside, you feel exposed. You imagine whispers, raised eyebrows, judgment, but most people either didn't notice or forgot within minutes. Some might even admire how you handled it. The moment felt huge to you because you were under your own spotlight. But to everyone else, it was just another passing moment in a larger evening. The spotlight effect also affects how we view our appearance. We obsess over a pimple, a wrinkle, or a bad hair day, believing it's the first thing people see. But ask yourself, how often do you remember minor flaws on other people? Probably not often. That's because you were never looking for them, and neither are they. This bias can cause unnecessary anxiety. It can make us over-prepare, hold back, or avoid situations where we feel exposed. We might skip a gym class because we think people will judge us. We might not ask a question in class because we fear sounding foolish. But in truth, most people won't notice, or they'll forget quickly. The spotlight effect also affects positive moments. We might expect praise for something we worked hard on and feel disappointed when others don't notice. Not because our work lacked value, but because others weren't watching as closely as we imagined. To counter this bias, it helps to adopt a simple truth. People aren't thinking about you nearly as much as you think they are. That's not an insult, it's a relief. It means you're free to make mistakes, try new things, and recover without the imagined glare of constant judgment. Ask yourself, if someone else made this mistake, would I remember it tomorrow? If not, chances are no one will remember yours, either, because the spotlight you feel, most of the time, it's only in your mind. The Just-World Fallacy. You hear about someone who lost their job unexpectedly. Quietly, a thought flickers through your mind. Maybe they weren't working hard enough. You don't mean to be harsh, but the thought is comforting. If bad, things only happen to those who somehow deserve it, then maybe you're safe. This is the Just-World Fallacy, the belief that the world is fundamentally fair and that people get what they deserve. Good things happen to good people. Bad things happen to bad people. It's a comforting idea. It gives us a sense of order and control. But it's not always true, and that's where the danger lies. This bias is subtle. We don't walk around saying, everyone deserves what they get. But it shows up in our assumptions. When someone succeeds, we think they must be talented or hardworking. When someone suffers, we wonder what they did wrong. We frame outcomes as reflections of character, not context, and in doing so, we oversimplify the world. The term was coined by social psychologist Melvin Lerner, who noticed that people often blame victims for their suffering, even when they had no control over what happened. In one experiment, participants watched a woman receive electric shocks during a memory task. When they couldn't intervene to help, they began to rate her more negatively, as if her suffering made more sense if she somehow deserved it. This is the dark side of the Just-World Fallacy. When fairness doesn't match reality, we bend our view of the person, not the system. It's emotionally easier to believe that someone deserved misfortune than to accept that life can be cruel and random. Let's look at a common scenario. You're scrolling through news stories and come across one about a person who lost their home in a natural disaster. The article is factual, but the comments are revealing. Why didn't they prepare? Why didn't they leave sooner? These aren't questions. They're defenses. Defenses against the uncomfortable truth that sometimes people suffer for reasons outside their control. And if it happened to them, it could happen to anyone, including us. The Just-World Fallacy also affects how we treat success. We assume wealth is always the result of hard work. That confidence means competence, that beauty equals goodness. But life is messier than that. Luck, privilege, timing, and social bias all play roles. When we ignore those factors, we risk praising people for advantages they inherited and blaming others for obstacles they couldn't choose. This mindset can be especially harmful in justice systems, healthcare, and education. Victims of crime may be questioned about what they were wearing. Patients may be judged for their lifestyle choices. Students may be labeled lazy without understanding their environment. When we look for reasons people deserved what happened to them, we stop asking what we can do to help. So how do we work against this bias? Start by noticing when you assign meaning to an outcome. Ask yourself, am I assuming this person caused their own misfortune because it makes me feel safer? Am I ignoring the role of chance, inequality, or complexity? Try replacing judgment with curiosity. Seek context before conclusions, because the world isn't always fair. But recognizing that doesn't make you cynical. It makes you more human. Kruger Effect. You're in a meeting. One person dominates the conversation, confident, loud, unwavering. They speak as if they know everything, but as the discussion deepens, it becomes clear they don't fully understand the topic. Meanwhile, someone else with real expertise stays quiet, hesitant to speak with the same certainty. It feels backward, but it's not uncommon. This is the Kruger Effect. A cognitive bias, where people with low ability in a domain overestimate their knowledge or competence, while those with higher ability tend to underestimate theirs. The less you know, the more likely you are to be unaware of what you don't know, and the more you know, the more clearly you see the gaps. The concept was introduced in 1999 by psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger. In a series of experiments, they found that participants who scored in the bottom quartile on tests of logic, grammar, and humor significantly overestimated their performance. The irony: their lack of skill prevented them from recognizing their lack of skill. This isn't about intelligence, it's about metacognition, the ability to assess your own thinking. When that self-awareness is low, people assume their surface understanding is deeper than it is. They mistake familiarity for mastery. Confidence fills the space where competence hasn't yet developed. Let's bring this into a familiar situation. You've just started learning a new skill, say photography. After watching a few tutorials, you feel ready. You're sure you get the basics. You might even start giving others advice. But weeks later, as you study more deeply, you begin to see how much you missed. You're no longer as confident, but you're more accurate. Your curve has shifted. This is the learning curve in motion. Confidence spikes early, then dips before rising again, slowly, steadily, and with humility. The Dunning-Kruger effect shows up across fields. In education, students who perform poorly often believe they did well. In business, inexperienced managers may overestimate their leadership. In debates, people argue with full confidence based on a headline or quote, believing it's enough to win. Meanwhile, experts tread carefully, aware of the nuance, the exceptions, the uncertainty. This imbalance creates real-world consequences. Decisions get made by the most assertive voice in the room, not the most informed. Social media amplifies this further. The loudest opinions often rise to the top, not because they're right, but because they're delivered with conviction. And confidence, as we've learned, feels like truth, even when it isn't. But the effect isn't just about others. We're all vulnerable to it. Whenever we enter a new area of knowledge, politics, parenting, nutrition, finance, we go through a phase where we think we've got it figured out, and that's when we're most at risk of misunderstanding. The danger lies in mistaking early knowledge for complete understanding. So how do we navigate this? The key is humility. Ask yourself, could I be missing something? Have I sought feedback from someone more experienced? Pay attention to how often you use absolute language. Always. Never. Definitely. Experts tend to say, it depends. That hesitation isn't weakness. It's wisdom earned through experience. Confidence without knowledge is loud, but knowledge without arrogance is what actually moves the world forward. Survivorship Bias. You watch a video titled, How I Made $1 Million by 25. The speaker looks confident, polished, grateful. They tell their story, risks taken, sleepless nights, breakthrough moments. It sounds like a blueprint for success, and quietly, a message settles in your mind. If they did it, maybe I can too. What you don't see are the thousands of others who tried the same path and didn't make it. They're not on stage. They're not featured in videos. Their stories didn't go viral, not because they lacked effort or courage, but because they didn't survive the odds. This is survivorship bias, the tendency to focus on people or things that made it past a selection process, while ignoring those that didn't. It's a classic distortion of data. We celebrate the winners and assume their strategies explain their success. But without accounting for the silent majority who followed similar paths and failed, we get an incomplete and misleading picture of reality. This bias first became widely known during World War II. Military analysts wanted to reinforce planes based on where returning aircraft showed the most damage, but statistician Abraham Wald suggested the opposite. Reinforce the areas that weren't damaged on the returning planes, because those were the shots that had taken down the aircraft that didn't come back. The insight was simple. You can't learn from survivors alone. In business, Survivorship bias shows up constantly. We idolize the founders of billion-dollar startups without studying the thousands of failed ventures with equally passionate leaders. We quote successful investors without analyzing how many others lost their savings chasing the same market trends. We call it vision, hustle, or mindset, when sometimes it was timing, connections, or pure chance. Let's bring this closer to home. You hear someone say, "I dropped out of college and built a company." You admire them. You consider whether college is necessary. But here's the hidden part. For every dropout who built an empire, there are countless others who dropped out and struggled, unseen. We hear the story because they succeeded. We think the story explains the success, but what it often explains is the exception. Survivorship bias isn't just about success stories. It's also about advice. When a celebrity says, "Never, give up," we nod along. But what if giving up at the right time was what saved them from wasting years on a dead end? We don't hear that story because they moved on before it could become one. In health, fitness, and even relationships, we see the same distortion. The person who recovered from illness with an obscure method becomes a symbol of hope. The couple who stayed together after hardship becomes proof that love conquers all. But we rarely hear about those who did everything right and still lost, or those who walked away for their own good. So how do we resist this bias? The key is to ask, what am I not seeing? Who didn't make it, and why? Seek the invisible data. Look for patterns, not just anecdotes. Consider base rates, the actual odds. And most importantly, be careful with conclusions drawn from stories designed to inspire. Inspiration isn't evidence. Emotion isn't analysis. Because for every loud success, there are hundreds of quiet attempts. And if we want to understand the truth, not just the triumphs, we have to listen for the stories that never got told.